Welcome to Remainders. I'm your host, Darren Burrell.
And I'm your co-host, Patrick McIntyre.
We will explore the stories from our conscious collection of music, books, and film.
The ones that have shaped our lives.
Join us as we take a closer look at what remains. Welcome to this week's Remainders. Today we're going to be talking about 2006's documentary, The Devil and Daniel Johnston. It's a documentary about the cult music icon, filmmaker, artist, and all-around hero to those of us who have known the magic and possibilities that come with recording a song in our garages and basements on a 4-track. It's a Bible of sorts for those who know mental illness and have grabbed it by the reins and held on long enough to be inspired by it. Pat, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Nice to see you.
Great to see you. Thank you for introducing me to Daniel Johnston and the do-it-yourself ethic that it was so prominent with them, and because that's definitely been an inspiration to me. Daniel Johnston's been championed, even covered by the likes of Beck, Tom Waits, Sonic Youth, Wilco, Nirvana, Fugazi, and many more. But even though he's been often tagged as a musician's musician, his mainstream status has always remained elusive. Johnston struggled with manic depression and schizophrenia throughout his entire adult life, and this has often prevented him from the success that many thought was deserved. I, for one, was unfamiliar with Johnston's career before now. I'm more than happy to discover it. But I want to turn it over to you, Darren, your own work. Your own art is versatile. You create, you record music, you write, you paint, you seem to do it all. Johnston had a similar diverse output of work. And I'm curious, when did you first discover his work and his diverse creations, and how has it influenced your own?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was kind of talked about in circles for musicians. You'd hear everybody every once in a while talk about Daniel Johnston. And like you mentioned, I remember seeing that shirt that Kurt Cobain wore of Hi, How Are You? It was sort of like, who is this? Who is this guy? And I think on the level of a musician like myself, after watching the documentary for the first time, which I did watch around the time it came out, 2007, 2008, I had the DVD with the extra features that I could watch back when that was a thing.
Physical media.
Yeah, that's right, physical media. I should mention that this is a bit of a departure from our script. We had another movie that we were going to watch this week that was about Rocky Erickson, a movie that I hadn't seen. So this is interesting that we're talking about something that it's a documentary about a musician that has a similar feel to the Rocky Erickson documentary. But Rocky Erickson's documentary just wasn't very readily available for us to watch, so we're going to push that back.
Yeah, so this movie actually has a lot of similarities to the story of Rocky Erickson. Rocky was the singer for the 13th Floor Elevators in the 60s. He's often been cited as the original creator of psychedelic rock. Janis Joplin almost joined his band back then. Rocky himself, similar to Daniel, he suffered from manic depression and schizophrenia, but it also didn't help that he was a fan of so many psychotropic drugs, which showed up in much of his music. He had some very difficult stays in a few different mental health hospitals, but he continued to make music through the 70s and 80s and made what I think was his best stretch of music, his horror rock years. If you combine Bob Dylan and the Misfits, you get an idea of what he sounded like. In the early 2000s, he recorded an album with Okkervil River, and he continued to tour. Both of them spent time in Austin, Texas, just more similarities between Daniel Johnston and him. They died less than 6 months apart from each other in 2019. The documentary, You're Gonna Miss Me, although we mentioned it's a little difficult to find, it gives such a great portrayal of how much he struggled, but how he would continue to use music and the creative process to overcome his personal challenges. So I rewatched the documentary today. I'm telling you, dude, you fucking love it.
The reason that I wanted to pivot to this is because I knew that you would like it as much as that documentary that was also about a musician that seemed to struggle with not fitting in necessarily and exploring why that was. And for Daniel Johnston, it was mental issues that came up and that he seemed to be a little off, and his family always thought he was a little off. How I connect to it as an artist is that I always felt I was a little off, that I couldn't help but create music. I couldn't help but paint and draw, and it was always looked at as, Darren, you need to get a real job. You need to stop doing these foolish things that aren't going to make you any money or going to get you any status in life, which, you know, in my later years, I know that's such bullshit, but you do listen to that because it's in our society. It's such a big pressure on somebody who is artistic. You either make money at it or you should stop doing it because it's not going to get you anywhere in life. And even my grandmother would tell me things, Darren, don't be an artist. There's no such living in that. And she was the greatest painter I ever knew. So I relate to a guy like Daniel Johnston and his story. Can put myself in the shoes of a guy who's not necessarily that good. And when I say that good, I mean he's not necessarily the greatest guitar player, the greatest piano player, or the greatest artist. But that's all in the eye of the beholder at the end of the day. And it's really about the individual, the guitar or the piano, and whatever that method of getting your message out as an artist doesn't really matter. And I think they show that a lot in this documentary. And what I'm trying to get to is that I never thought that I was the greatest guitar player or the greatest singer or the greatest painter, but I knew that I had something I wanted to say, and I knew that those were like the vessel to get that artistic expression out. And it didn't matter if I could play it great, I just had to kind of play 4 chords, and it didn't matter if they were perfect. So maybe that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely curious. A lot of what you just said relates to Johnston's popularity among other musicians. As I mentioned, all those other artists, they championed him, they knew him, they were fans of his work, and yet he was never anybody that was able to achieve mainstream success. Certainly no popular songs, no record. He barely had a record contract that was successful. He had one briefly, and then he was dropped because it sold nothing. So I'm curious about your thoughts creating your own work. As I mentioned, a musician's musician. Your work resonates with other artists. It definitely does, as Johnston's does. When you have art that's popular with other artists, is that different from mainstream success?
I'm a big fan of getting the respect of your peers. So if you're a painter and there's another painter that enjoys it, to me, sometimes that's almost more of a symbol of, if you want to say, success than most things, because you know that that person, that artist, understands what it takes to do it. And so getting the respect of your peers is definitely something that I hold in high regard for myself. But I also think what he says in The Story of an Artist,
great song.
Yeah, that we get to see a lot of the montage of his childhood. And for the listeners out there, Daniel Johnston was very good at, before cell phones, before any of that, he had, you know, a Super 8 camera that he would constantly make little movies on. And he would make recordings of himself talking about his life, almost like a journal. And he would journal it through his songs, but also oftentimes just thoughts, random thoughts he would have. And so there's this great documentary put together by really a lot of the artist's catalog of things that he had chronicled throughout his entire life. And so that's why it makes it kind of special, is that you're getting this real direct insight into his life from his experiences, because he filmed it and he recorded it.
He's creating these home movies, which I thought were so creative, and they show a full one. It shows him just doing all these different, almost silent film act impersonations. It was like Charlie Chaplin style stuff. And I love that as like a film buff, and I'm sure you appreciate that too. Especially they reminded me of early Steven Spielberg movies that he made in his youth. They just had a very similar frenetic energy. I don't know if you've seen the documentary Spielberg.
I have.
Where it showcases like a lot of those clips of his early work when he's like 10, 11 years old. He's got like homemade explosives. He's got chases, obviously, like every Spielberg film. And it's like such a perfect like insight to what would come. Obviously, Johnston didn't become a filmmaker or anything, but it showcases just like how when you're young and you want to do something, you just fucking did it. It's almost like when you're young, the older you get, the more you wait for somebody to give you permission. But when you're young, you just fucking do it.
Yeah. And I mean, back in DVD days again, you know, with our old collection that we were amassing back in the Suncoast days, I mean, all of those old M. Night Shyamalan DVDs would have an old film that he made as a child as an Easter egg in there. Do you remember that?
Yeah, totally.
So all those filmmakers were doing that. I did that. I had my dad's old, VCR kind of, you put a tape in there and I was able to edit all those. I still have them somewhere. That was so great. Yeah, as a kid, you didn't care. You just did it. That's very well said. And one other thing to talk about with regards to Chaplin stuff, he has a friend that goes on screen and then mentions that Daniel didn't even know who Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton was. And I wrote a note here.
That.
Yeah, I love that too, because he said, his high school friend mentions that Daniel wouldn't be the guy who would say, this is my Chaplin period or my Keaton era. Most like artistic film buff types would say things like that. Oh, I'm in my Keaton period, or I'm Charlie Chaplin. But because Daniel didn't even know who those legends were. The film that he made, anybody would think was made by Chaplin, where he's got all these expressions and it's very silent film looking. He inherently had that. That was just him and wanting to make these things that would get a reaction out of anybody watching it. And I think that really showed so much without any inspiration from the outside world, how great this guy was going to be.
His friend's quote, I actually wrote it down, he never sits and thinks, what am I going to do? He just grabs something. He just does it. Like, that was his basic takeaway from his best friend. It's like, he never planned, he never schemed, he never like kind of thought himself out of work. I'm definitely familiar with that experience of you just think yourself out of something because maybe you don't think it's going to turn out the way you wanted to do it.
Some folks have said that to me about the amount of work that I do. I think that's a good moment for me to talk about just personally. You can't worry so much about what you put out there in the world. If you feel the need to do it, you can put it out and it doesn't matter what people think. It's hard to do that because it takes a while to understand that there's going to be some criticism involved in your art. But at the end of the day, you're on to the next thing. If you're an artist that really cares about what you do and how you have to do it, the next thing is coming already by the time you put that thing out into the world, whether it's on social media or a gallery or whatever it may be. There's no way that you can stop yourself. And to hold it in, well, what's the point of that? I mean, to each their own. But for me, I've always had that notion that I've made it. I want people to know about it. Maybe it'll be helpful in their lives somehow. And if not, that's okay too. But I'm already on to the next thing that might do it for you.
I love that.
And maybe that gets into something that I'm just thinking about now. Maybe why some people feel like they're not having success because they feel like I've done all these things and I'm not rich and famous yet. Well, if you can take the I'm not rich and famous part out of that, you'll realize how successful you really are as an artist.
So like internalizing goals. And so instead of getting 1 million hits on Spotify, your goal is to spend 8 hours a day recording the best music you possibly can.
That's right. Yeah, 100%, and well said. I get a lot of people that'll tell me, you need to have a good social media presence and this, that, and other thing. And I think in terms of marketing and advertising and yourself, sure, that all fits into the mix. But really, if you have nothing to market and advertising, what's the point? It really has to come from the work. It has to be good, but in your own way. It has to be good in your own way. As we mentioned with Daniel Johnston, at least my opinion is that he wasn't a great guitar player, but he had a message that was very good.
And he was definitely good at marketing himself. He was always giving people his music, talking about his music, talking about himself, making the music. It wasn't in a narcissistic way at all or anything, but it was in just like kind of practical terms. This is in the early 80s, so this is not of any time with putting your music on the internet. He basically talked his way into being featured on MTV. That's a testament to how confident he had in himself.
Just to sum up something I was talking about earlier in that song, The Story of an Artist, the first line of that song is, "Listen up and I'll tell you a story about an artist growing old." That right there tells you it's fun and cute when you're younger and you can make all these creative things, but you need to put together a life for yourself. It starts out before that with recording of, I think it was probably the girl that he was, as they talk about in the film, obsessed with, Lori. And she says, I don't know, it's like when you go to read your own poetry, you get all choked up. To me, That says so much in that. An artist, a lot of times, whether you're a writer or you're a filmmaker, if you go back and look at some of the things that you've done, at times and this is the best thing about drinking for me, to be honest with you, I love getting a glass of wine or a bottle or 2 bottles of wine and sitting out on my balcony or a place that makes me feel good and literally getting smashed and listening to my own work. I know that sounds a little vain or maybe crazy to some people, but there's so much emotion and so much thought and so many things that go into the work that I create that when I listen back, I do get choked up. I do get very emotional. And that's why I think a lot of times on social media, artists and different people that create things will kind of put this whole blurb in it about the story behind it. And people obviously scroll past it. But they're trying to convey, like, please listen to this piece of music or this writing or this podcast I did, because so much of me goes into this. And I really want people to see that. But obviously, you can't see inside somebody's soul. You have to listen to it to hear it. And the ones that really connect are people like Daniel Johnston, who are telling these stories. He invites us into his mind where the experiences he talks about, his inner circle not understanding that he wants to do these things and create this stuff, and they don't really like what you do, and they don't think anybody ever will. That's one of the lines. His proclamation that the people around him think that his gift is a problem is a real good setup for the documentary in general. He needs to get a job. He needs to be normal. He witnesses them sitting in front of the TV and laughing and thinking that this is so much fun. So they think that that's normal and that's what you should be doing. And he's like, but I'm out here appreciating the sun, appreciating the flowers, every little thing that nature has to give you, I think is such a big statement in such a simple song. Really, it's just his voice and it's a piano the whole time. But if you really listen, yeah, you will get choked up listening to that. I connect to it, at least as an artist, so much that people just seem to be against you as an artist that don't understand what it's like to be one. Because society, I think, says, well, it's kind of childish to paint pictures. It says it's a little childish to write songs. And let's just talk about ageism there, to write songs even past your 20s. It seems to be, that's childish, Why are you going after this dream? It's such a child's dream. And this song does a lot for that. I know I've talked a lot about this subject, but this song especially I wanted to talk about. Did you get any of those similar feelings when you were listening to that song?
I did, quite a bit. And knowing you for as long as I have, I can definitely understand the amount of value that you get out of it. It's essentially his ode to the creative person, the life of an artist. And the lyrics are so sincere, yet they're simple enough to essentially be applicable for the listener to anyone who's ever recorded a song or even picked up a paintbrush or done anything creative. You really get the story of an artist.
I know, it's simple to say, right? But that's it. It's a story of an artist, and if you could understand what it might be like to be someone who has the desire to create for a living and sort of the pressures of the real world, that is your family or your inner circle or just society in general that thinks you need to have some sort of well-paying job to make you happy in life. And Pat, you and I both know that that's not true. To be happy, you could be happy with $0 in your pocket as long as you're doing what you love.
Yeah. I definitely responded to just the amount of obstacles that he presents in such a short, simple song. He presents life obstacles in these straightforward lyrics that, like, as I said, are almost applicable to anybody who's ever tried to create. And that's what makes it such a timeless song, I think.
The reason why it's such a great setup to have that song being displayed pretty early, it's really the first song that we hear from him. The setup is good for a few reasons. One, it's talking about an artist and those struggles, but then I think it's also alluding to some of the mental issues that he has. And then you have to wonder, were a lot of those mental issues brought on by not being able to be afforded what his God-given gift, that it was okay to do that it was fostered? I mean, his parents, you don't think that they don't foster his talent and love him and appreciate him, but he has recorded as you see in the film, his mother telling him, you want to seek this fame and it's going to hurt you. And then there's a lot of religious moments in here. Daniel becomes obsessed with religion in the way that the devil is coming after him. And so I think that this early stage in his life is forming a lot of what might happen to him in the future. Did you get that?
No doubt. I mean, his mother directly confronts him, to quote, "You're an unprofitable servant of the Lord." And his response is, I'm an unserviceable prophet. And I love that response. And just the for one, the wordplay there, and then just a complete rebuttal. It's like, this is who I am. I'm a person who wants to create. And it doesn't matter if it makes money or not for God. I love that.
I think it's not overbearing about the religion in this film, but it's
no,
good,
not at all.
It's good to note that that's something that I think in society in general, the pressures of being someone who has parents that are very religious and expect you to follow a righteous path somehow can have a lot of pressures and stresses on your life, especially when you throw in the mix the art and the need to create yourself. One thing that I took away from this film is Daniel having a muse in a way, and they explore this more, and I remember seeing it, and I believe it was the extra features of the DVD. So Pat, you wouldn't really know this because they didn't really show it in the Amazon Prime digital streaming option. But when I had the DVD, the extra features had actually explored a little bit more where she is. They talk at the end of the film that this muse, this woman that Daniel had met in art school, that he really seemed to think he was going to marry. And it's a brief moment that they had known each other. Her name is Lori Allen. There's a part in the film that Daniel says this: "She inspired 1,000 songs, and then I knew I was an artist." What better way to make a proclamation that you're an artist than you have written a love song? You have done something and created something from a place of love. That to me is so beautifully said, and I believed it right away when I heard that. I didn't need to hear anything else that he wrote, that he recorded. That he had experienced love and that he needed to put it down into a creative format was enough for me.
I instantly perked up when I heard that quote because I think it's incredibly powerful. So yeah, I love that scene. It's showing a home video of Lori. She's singing, dancing in the art room. I assume it's like where they were working together when they were young. And the scene, it's having Daniel reciting a poem over the video, the old school video of the two of them. He's expressing his love and adoration for her. And then it cuts to Daniel's face in the present. It's still reciting the recording from his youth, but there's still the clip of Lori dancing in the corner of the screen. It's almost like a thought bubble when he's sitting and still reciting the line. You can see the melancholy on his face, but you still see the expression of love. And then that's when he says, "She inspired 1,000 songs, and then I knew I was an artist." I loved it.
Yeah, that's such a great moment. He has to be brought to his brother's house because he starts to have a little bit of trouble with his family. And then his brother says, "I will take Daniel in." And from there, that's where Daniel kind of is stripped of all the things he had in his parents' house, meaning, a guitar, piano, and different things. So he decides to make a record, but he's going to make a record in his brother's garage. And so he takes his brother's workbench and converts that into a piano, something to write songs on. And his brother was dumbfounded that one day all of a sudden his workbench was turned into this recording studio. And I think one thing that this documentary does very well, they paint a very good picture for the viewer of what that scene might have looked like. They recreate that workbench, if you recall, Pat. They have that Casper the Friendly Ghost cup that's sitting there, and the light is trickling in from the cracks in the garage door, and it's really beautifully done. That's not the only time they do it. They do it also when they go to the carnival where Daniel works, and they show you the inner workings of where the corn dogs are made and different things. So as a viewer, you're really put into Daniel's sort of state of mind, and you see what he would have seen. It really helps you connect to Daniel Johnston in this film. From there, they start to talk about a little bit of success, right? He walks down the path of MTV knocking down his door and moving to Austin, Texas, which we all know is a big hub for musicians. South by Southwest is always there every year, except for, of course, when there's a pandemic. And I believe in that moment, it's also a little scary and a little forewarning tale that you can have a little taste of fame and what that means in our society. That people will love and adore you for the music you make, and it'll be all kinds of money or notoriety on MTV. And that could kind of haunt you for the rest of your life, that you feel like once you achieve a little bit of that, it needs to happen for you. And as we see later on, that Daniel never really gets that type of notoriety in his rest of his career, But for a moment there, it's really happening for Daniel, and they talk about him working in a McDonald's, and that's, people would always come and bother him there. He makes Hi, How Are You in his brother's garage, and that gives him the ability to go out and tell everybody, you got to play my tape, you got to hear my tape, you've got to listen to me. And he was sort of his own best salesman in those times, and people were taking notice.
Yeah, it definitely accentuates the do-it-yourself ethic that he carried with him through his entire career. So I love the idea of you sitting on your balcony, having some wine, enjoying your own music. As friends, I've been able to enjoy your music, The Scissors with TLB, over the years at various Chicago venues. I don't think I was drinking wine there. It was probably old style.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've thought multiple times, Darren's such an amazing artist that why do I get to enjoy it? So the notion that you're sitting and enjoying your own music is very meaningful to me.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Yeah, I think there's an idea out there that you shouldn't, as an artist, kind of relish in the work that you've done. And maybe that goes with the idea that I mentioned about kind of moving on past it and putting it out in the world, and now it's none of your business. But those are times in your life, if you're Woody Allen, I think, has always said, at least from what I've heard, that that's not him in the movies. That's another character. Well, I always kind of call bullshit on that. Like, where does that come from? You can't really just write something out of the blue. It always comes from some sort of personal space. So the idea of sitting on my balcony and getting drunk and, sometimes I'm not going to lie, I do cry a lot when I listen to this stuff because it does come from such a personal place. My work in my life lately has been trying to let go of that stuff and not hold on to it so much. So a lot of times I feel like so many good inspirational things have come from these moments in my life that I'm talking about through the art that I don't want to let them go almost. I almost don't want to let go of the hurt or the pain because it has inspired such great things, or it's given me some sort of a platform to make something great. It's hard to make stuff when you're in a really good state of mind. Maybe that's why Daniel Johnston was able to make such great art for his entire career, because he, something we need to get into here, which is a big part of the movie, is his mental illness.
You think it's hard to make stuff when you're in a good state of mind?
Well, for me, at least it has been.
Yeah.
Maybe I kind of enjoy life a little bit more and step away from making and creating art when that happens.
Well, you've made it sound like creation has always been a form of therapy for you.
Oh, yeah. There's no doubt about that, yeah.
Okay. There's a notion that, like, if you're content, you don't really have anything to say.
Right.
Obviously, that's different for everybody. I don't even know if that's right for myself. I don't know. What do you think about that? Like, if you feel like you're a content, happy person, is there a drive to create?
Maybe I just haven't gotten there yet. Maybe I just need to get there a little bit and create with a lot more excitement going on in my life instead of negative, depressing things. As you and I both know, and we both have similar stories, we both have a void, which is our fathers. And so for me, that has carried a lot of the work that I've done. And then, of course, girls and breakups, and that comes with the territory for anybody. But life-changing, life-altering things in my life has propelled a lot more work than the good things have. So, I don't know. That's just me. But maybe, and like I said, maybe I haven't gotten to some state of nirvana or from a positive place. And I look forward to that if that's the case.
Do you create out of inspiration, or do you create out of habit and structure? Or maybe both?
Honestly, it's a little bit more out of when I'm inspired. But I have a structure to it when I do it. It's
because I love hearing about artists, just the different formats they do. It's like, I do this for 2 hours a day and I don't think about it otherwise. David Bowie was the opposite. He wouldn't do anything for months at a time, and then he would work 72 hours straight on something that he comes up with. So
yeah, it's kind of like, when you're going about your day and you're in a lot of times it's the shower for me. My mom has told me something which I try to instill on a lot of people, that the shower is the place that you get to be alone and you truly can block out everything in the world. So if you're having a bad day and there's some work thing that's coming up, well, those 10 to 15 to 20 minutes, if you're fortunate enough to have a shower in your place and you can take one, You get to go in there by yourself and leave everything else out. And I've tried to really use that as something that I get to be alone for that time, even though I'm alone all the time. I don't have anybody living in my apartment and everything like that, but that's where nobody can get at me. And so a lot of my ideas come in there, and a lot of times it'll happen within like the first 5 minutes, and I'm like enjoying the moment and the time alone and the shower and the warmth of the water, and I'm like, God damn it, now I got to get out because I have this great idea about something I want to paint or I want to put it together. And then that literally fuels my entire day. My entire day is like pinpointed focus on that, and I cannot stop until it's done. It's really a wonderful thing, because then all of the troubles in my life fade away. Anything else, because I've got my mission almost, that's like my mission for the day. And it can happen at any time. It doesn't happen every day, for sure. And you can't force it. I've learned that, because the work just is not satisfying if you try.
I mean, it sounds like it gives you a real purpose when you come across that.
Absolutely. Getting back to Daniel Johnston, I wonder if he felt like he was fulfilled in what he was doing, if he felt that he had purpose. I don't really get into that, or you don't really hear it from him.
No, yeah, you don't really get a sense of... He was so expressive, like, as you mentioned, with his audio journaling. It's like he was always recording himself or taping himself, and you get so much of that. So it shows, like, what he was doing and what he was working on, but you didn't really get too much of a sense of what he was thinking. There was actually a very impactful part.
Yeah, and I can understand what you're saying, too, with, like, some of those scenes where he's got like a camera and it's filmed, and there's a picture of him from like up high, and he's playing piano, and then there's like a couple stills they show, and you kind of wonder, like, did he set the camera up to film, to shoot that? Did somebody? No one else could have shot that, right? And then you're kind of like, well, but he had the idea to take that photo, so he must have thought of himself as... What was he thinking? You never really get to hear that.
So at one point, he records himself describing the symptoms from his recent, so this is when he was younger, his recent diagnosis of manic depressive with grand illusions. He starts naming off all the different characteristics. It's like hearing a stream of poor choices like drug use and high-risk sex, coupled with the notion of living a dangerous and depressing life. And the entire time he's like listing off all these things, he's kind of laughing throughout the reading. He's like chuckling at multiple parts. And that kind of suggests to me that he thinks that it's a litany of issues or behaviors he may or may not have or do, but he's not really taking it too seriously. I have no idea whether he's doing all these things or whether he feels like he has none of these aspects in his life. So he's cognizant of what his diagnosis is, but he's not really letting it be an identifier for himself.
It's interesting because I've suffered from anxiety from a very early age, and that stemmed from the loss of my father. And so that's kind of the length of my mental illness. And I don't even know if they would consider that a mental illness. So it's hard for me to relate. I'd like to more. Do you relate to mental illness, like especially in a movie like this where you can see it in his face as he gets older, that he kind of gets a little warped looking almost, and you can see that the mental illness takes over a little bit more than when he was younger. He seems like he becomes a little more crippled.
His life is a process, as all of our lives are, and you definitely get the sense that art was his therapy, but unfortunately he wasn't always able to create it. And so I think that manifests in a lot of the episodes that he succumbs to that put himself and other people in danger. I've experienced anxiety and I've experienced lows, depression, just like everybody else. And the one thing that I've learned is it's the amount of letting go that really dictates whether that process continues in a productive manner.
Yeah. I guess that's something that's taken me a long time to figure out, but you're right. I think I held on to it too long because I liked almost feeling depressive. I almost liked that. I almost liked it because it was coming out in the art too, but it wasn't very healthy. And again, I don't really know too much about mental illness in general, and I think that's something that I can take away, something that remains for me to be better about understanding mental illness and the way that it affects people in different ways. It's so easy to write off somebody and say they're crazy and not understand that they're going through something that you just fully don't understand.
It's also contextual. If somebody experiences trauma, if you talk to that person the day after an extremely traumatic experience, I think a lot of society would say, oh, that person's crazy. But again, that's not the case.
Some of the moments you talked about with him having mental illness episodes is that he thought that the devil was always around, and it comes out in his art. There was all of these negative things, and it comes out in some unfortunate incidences. One, I believe his previous manager, he hit over the head with a pipe 3 times, and he started experimenting with some drugs and things like that, which also just elevated the mental illness, as they talk about in the documentary. But little moments like that would land him in mental institutions. There was a holiday with his family where an incident happened and he had to get taken away by the police to be in a mental institution. And they even talk about at one point he's in a mental institution and a record label comes and talks about signing him. He's sitting here in this mental institution, but unbeknownst to him, Nirvana, like we spoke about earlier, is going and playing all these performances and doing all these magazine shoots with his album cover of Hi, How Are You on Kurt Cobain's shirt. And so he becomes even more heightened as a cult, musical figure hero. And then, of course, the story that he's in a mental institution and all the things that when people dig deeper and find out what's going on with Daniel Johnston just makes it an even cooler story for people to get behind him and his art, I think. And so at that point, you're kind of like, wow, maybe there's a resurgence for Daniel Johnston. He's gone through a lot of battles, but maybe if he can and they talk about it, all we got to do is get him better. And all of a sudden, his musical career is back on track. And then, of course, he does get signed and he gets dropped, which I think it just adds to the tragedy that is sort of becoming his life at the end here, with mental illness and all the other things that are stacked up against him. He finally gets and signs a major label, and he sells, I think, less than 5,000 copies?
Definitely responded a lot to the support system that he had kind of in place, even though he didn't always accept it. After he arrives in New York, he shows a few more signs of struggling, and I thought about other people who may not be in the similar situations of support. He had family, he had friends, he had coworkers, he had this artistic community that were all kind of like championing and rallying behind him, which is part of the reason why he's been able to continue for so long. It really made me think about how important that type of support is.
A lot of times when I talk with friends that there's different things that come up, right? Like, my parents don't have any money to help me along in my career, so it's up to me to make my own living. That makes you feel different and maybe have more animosity towards people who do have parents that have money that are able to help them along in their career. And then you think, well, if only I had the money from daddy and mommy. But the support system for you is a big deal. Whether it's what I just talked about or whether it is actually emotionally supportive. And I think from his parents, you can see Daniel Johnston did have emotional support, and they're very passionate about him, especially his father, He seems very emotional talking about it, that they just wanted him to get to a good spot in his life.
I mean, his father eventually became his manager. There's no doubt they were committed to his happiness and his success.
One line in one of his songs, "Do yourself a favor, become your own savior." I related to that a lot. I've been trying to do that for a long time, but even more so this year. I talk about being the president of your own life, and that means, I'm sure, a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But right now, especially with so much division, well, the first thing that you can do is be your own leader in your own life. And then whatever happens in the elections and things like that, well, that's fine, because I'm taking care of me first.
I read that as distinguishing between what you can control in life and what you cannot control in life. And the only thing you can control are your own actions and your own reactions to all the bullshit that may happen outside of your life.
Do yourself a favor, become your own savior. See, then that's the thing with remainders. All of these things that you can take away, and sometimes they are just reminders of things that you may be doing right in your life anyway. I feel like that's a big part of the book that you borrowed me on Stoicism and practicing that philosophy, is that you get excited when you read something that you're like, oh, that's a good reminder because I do that already. Maybe I just need to do it a little bit more, or be a little bit more about practicing it, right? And there's a ton of that in these lyrics from Daniel Johnston. There's a ton of, he gets it the way that I do. And not just on an artistic level for an artist to connect to, but on a human level. These songs are so prolific that way.
It reminded me a little bit of Bukowski and the structure of his lyrics, and just how fucking simple they were, which is the secret success of Bukowski, is just how he was able to portray life in such a simplistic way. You know, a lot of people use that as a criticism against him, but that was his style. And obviously for stuff like this, it comes through, and it basically becomes a maxim that anybody can say to themselves, and it instantly has a transforming effect.
I agree with that, and maybe that's another reason why the simplicity of the songs just speaks to everybody, because you hear these rhymes, and you're like, man, they're so childish. It's almost like they're such a childlike, that the mental illness seems to bring on a more childlike demeanor almost to Daniel Johnston, that it's like his worldview is more, less responsibility. I don't know what I'm trying to say here.
Strips away all the bullshit.
Kind of. It's like blinders, I guess, in the way that he goes about things, and that comes out in his music, because you hear these sort of nursery rhymes. The end of each line is so obvious that it's going to be that rhyme, but what he says in between those rhymes is almost so prolific and beautiful and just connects so well. You were talking about Bukowski, but from what I know about Hemingway, I think he was the same way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. What you were saying was kind of remind me of it's more of a thought exercise in academia, but it's unless you can describe something to a 5-year-old, you don't really understand it yourself.
Wow. Yeah.
And so the way you were just describing it kind of reminded me of that. It's like Johnston with his lyrics is like basically he's kind of describing life to a 5-year-old, and they're kind of understanding the lifelong experience of somebody at a young age, and you can understand it in these simple lyrics, and that's why it's so impactful.
Maybe that's why some people don't really like to go the route of listening to somebody that makes you think a lot. It's a lot easier just to kind of like know it on a level that's a little more easy to take in.
Are you saying his music is the one that's making you think a lot?
No, I mean, like, if I would go listen to like Radiohead as opposed to Daniel Johnston, it would be like two different worlds.
You could go both ways. I think, I can't remember, what's his name? The singer.
Oh, Tom York?
Yeah, I think Tom York was a huge fan of him, actually, but they're both making music around the same time, and they almost represent, they're both in kind of indie alternative rock, and they kind of represent two different strategies of music to get to the same place, and kind of recognition of consciousness in life. Radiohead, you have basically infusing academia into their music, whereas Johnston is almost making nursery rhymes to a certain degree, but they're still trying to get to the same point.
You know, it's interesting, if you read the Roger Ebert review on this film, he does say, and we obviously love Roger Ebert, as we did our first episode on Roger and the movie Life Itself, but he had mentioned that he doesn't really understand the notoriety for Daniel Johnston because he didn't think he was very good. And sure, I can agree with Roger on that. I talked about him not being very good. But that goes to show you everybody's entitled to their own opinion when it comes to music and what they take out of it. But also that I think Roger probably saw that on a level that was maybe just he didn't dig in as much as we are right now. That the lyrics actually had a lot to say more than just the bad playing of the guitar and out of time instrumentation that you hear in a lot of the songs. It's hard to dig into some art sometimes like that. I hate to go against anything Ebert said because I love him, but you know, it's hard. If you have a bad recording of a song, well, my point here is that Daniel definitely had bad recordings, but I love the band The Cardigans. And everybody out there, don't make fun of me because of Love Fool. The Cardigans, just like Warren Zevon, is more than Werewolf in London. The Cardigans are way more than Love Fool. And the lead singer, Nina, had put out a solo record in 1998, I think it was. Yeah, maybe it was 2001. And it was by the name A Camp. And she had Walking the Cow by Daniel Johnston on there that she covered. I had no clue and had never seen this documentary, and I love that song. I thought it was a little weird, Walking the Cow. I was like, what does that mean? Why would Nina sing it like that? But there's that, I guess you would say it's the chorus, like, I really don't know why I'd stay here, oh. And when she does that, I was like, oh my God, this is a beautiful, wonderful song. Well, turns out it's Daniel Johnston. And his songs at the core are very good. You might just need to get around the rough edges.
All right, yeah. So what you were saying about Ebert not really being a big fan of his music. It's obviously not a controversial opinion. I think a lot of people kind of hear some of the songs and they're not really that impressed with him. Obviously, his voice is kind of lispy, it's kind of childish. Everything he did was very rough, and that's obviously part of the charm, but at the same time, it doesn't sound polished, so I think that turns a lot of people off. But I think it was also a testament to, as I mentioned, him being such a musician's musician. He was adored by so many of those prominent musicians that I mentioned, like Kurt Cobain, Beck, Tom Waits. I mean, he was so popular among them, and yet he just didn't have that type of success among regular listeners. I think that's one of the best ways to discover music, is by finding who you love, what they listen to. I'll listen to a rock critic for sure, but I'm more interested in learning what Nick Cave is listening to. I'm more interested in learning what Leonard Cohen is listening to, and I've discovered plenty of obscure bands because of that. I still remember discovering, I don't remember who it was, but I discovered Iggy and the Stooges when I was really young, not by seeing an article or anything, but hearing about some rock band that was like, oh, this is one of my favorite bands, so that's what I was going to check out. And then to go back to Johnston, his music was so raw, and again, that's kind of why he was so popular among musicians, is that it was the whole package. It was his do-it-yourself aesthetic and his ethic, making all the tapes himself. He would re-record albums himself to give to different people. It wasn't like this always the same album. It was like, oh, this is the physical copy that I recorded last night that you have. Somebody else wants it? Oh, I'm going to go record it again. And
right, there's probably 20 versions of the same record because he just didn't know how to dub it, so he just re-recorded the whole thing from scratch.
At least.
Yeah.
And so one of his girlfriends, he was dating Kathy McCarthy from Glass Eye, frequent collaborators, and she ended up doing an album of covers of his. This was early, even still before that he got full recognition. And she mentions it's some of the best stuff that she's ever recorded. That's a testament to, even though he wasn't polished, he was a gifted songwriter and a gifted musician. And sometimes it took somebody else to even elevate that.
Yeah, she says, if I'm going to be known for anything that I've done, it will be this collection of covers of Daniel's work that I've done.
Putting a testament to how original his writing was.
Towards the end of the film, we get to see Daniel getting older, and the days of Kurt Cobain wearing his shirt are definitely over. And it's not like he's down on his luck. In many ways, he's the exact same guy he was when we saw him at the beginning of the film. But he's got a new bunch of young kids that live in town, and they're going to help him make his way into continuing playing his music, which I think is super cool. I remember seeing Chuck Berry in 2011 or something like that, and yes, he did tune his guitar for about an hour on stage, and yes, he did have to leave in an ambulance that night, but it was Chuck fucking Berry, and it was amazing. And his band, as per usual, was a bunch of people from town that he just said, hey, you're my band for tonight, learn my songs, and I'm going to tell you and call them out on an audible about what I want to play. Which, a lot of it's that rock and roll kind of bluesy stuff that you could kind of figure it out as you go along. So any good musician can figure it out on a whim. But that being said, it's kind of like Chuck Berry in a way where it's like put anybody on stage. As long as Daniel's there, I want to see it. And I am very disappointed. I never got to see him live before his passing last year in September. And as we end our conversation on Daniel, there's some things that happened to him too with his father that are pretty amazing moments. You see a portrait of them, his parents and Daniel, at the end of the film where the camera kind of comes in on them, and you're reminded of moments in the film that happen, like Daniel throwing the keys of the plane that his father is flying out the window, and they had to crash land. They show it. This is insane. You need to see the film too to really see his father choke up about this moment, that Daniel was so mentally ill that he thought that they could be like Casper and parachute out when there was no parachute in the plane. So he throws the keys to the plane out the window, and his father, okay, well, we're going to have to deal with this. And he finally got a hold of the plane and crash landed. And on the way to the hospital where they took Daniel, they passed by a church, and the church outside has the sign that says, God promises a safe landing, but not a calm voyage, which is just kind of funny to see that sign after you get in a plane crash, but it's sort of a nice ending to the movie for me. You're going to have a safe landing at the end, and the work that you do is worth it. Whether people know you forever or they don't, life is not a calm voyage, right? Life in general is full of ups and downs, and you can create things along the way. And hopefully, if God exists to you, you're going to have a safe landing to your final destination. And for Daniel Johnston, I'd like to think that he did, and I would like to thank him for changing my life, hearing the story of an artist, to be able to feel like there's somebody like me out there. And I look for that.
The creative process was meditative for him, and the way he was able to utilize that throughout his entire life, and just how that's applicable to anybody. You can always use art as therapy.
And whether it's writing, painting, making music, all of the above, the same rules apply. Do it because you have to, because that's what is inside of you. And Daniel certainly is an inspiration for both of us to continue to go forward doing what we love, even if it's scary, even if it's something that we don't think is the best product at the end. We didn't do it because we wanted to have something that was going to make us money, that was going to get the biggest acclaim on television or on the radio. We really just did it because we have to, and we love it. And with that being said, I'd like to thank everybody for listening to our third episode of Season 1 of Remainders, and remind you that we have 2 episodes previously that you can go back and listen to if you haven't already. The previous one before this was on the Florida Project, and the one before that was on Roger Ebert from our hometown of Chicago. Pat, anything you want to say before we say goodnight?
No, man, you did a great job.
You did a great job, man. I love talking about this with you guys. And to remind everybody out there, the reason we do this is because we had a wonderful time talking about movies and art in general at a little movie store back when we were kids. So you out there listening allows us to continue to do that, which we are eternally grateful for. So with that, I will say thanks again for listening to Remainders. We hope that you check out The Devil and Daniel Johnston, and have a great night. You have been listening to Remainders. This episode was written, narrated, and produced by Darren Varell and Patrick McIntyre. Original music, episode art, logo, and editing by Darren Varell. Find out what else remains by visiting our website at remainderspod.com. And we're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Just search @RemainersPod. Please tell anyone you can about our show, and we look forward to telling you more of what remains next time.